This is The World Unpacked. I'm Doug Farrer. 4 months into the war in Ukraine, the early exhilaration of Ukrainian battlefield victories has faded, and a grinding, violent, and ugly back and forth is now the status quo on the battlefield. We know a lot about what's happening in Ukraine, militarily, politically, but also the Ukrainian people are daily shown to us on television, on TikTok, and social media. We know a lot less about life in Russia. Sure, there's a perception that Russia is strongly behind Putin and his quote-unquote special operation. But Russia is not a monolithic state. It's a deeply conflicted place where old and young who consume different information have different perspectives on whether Russia is doing legitimate military action on behalf of its security or is an aggressor seeking to take over territory that belongs to the Ukrainian people. Longtime friends in Russia and even Russian family members have fallen out over the war. For nearly 30 years, the Carnegie Moscow Center sought to build bridges between Russia and the West and open a space for civil society in Russia. But the Kremlin decided to close us down a few months ago. One of the most impressive and thoughtful writers from the Carnegie Moscow Center is Andrei Kolesnikov. Andrei has been a scribe for the Russian people, looking not just at polling data and public views on the war, but the way in which the Russian people try to get through their daily lives, carrying the burden of crippling sanctions and the status as a rogue nation led by a violent and unhinged dictator. What's life like in Moscow? What's the future for Putin and the Russian people? Andrei is going to help us lift the veil. Here we go. Andrei, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot.
So I want to start with something you've been focusing on a lot, which is the Russians' mood with respect to the war. Putin launched the war in February, and at the time there were some anti-war protests, but in general it seemed like Russian public was behind the war. Where's the Russian public mood today?
Yeah, it's maybe the main question in the story of the invasion. First of all, nothing before the invasion indicated that the war would be supported to this extent. After 2018, after the raising of the retirement age, Putin's ratings fell and stagnated. People were focused on socioeconomic problems. However, the shock of Putin's audacity and toughness on February 24, when he invaded Ukraine, was so strong and the propaganda support was so powerful that people actively supported the special operation. The event simply had no precedent, and people had no opinion on how to relate to what was happening. So they decided to join the official mainstream. It was much easier for them. Putin is a president of war and hatred, and his ratings were always soaring in the circumstances of the conflicts, rivalry with the West, with Georgia, etc., etc. However, it should be understood that this proverbial, let's say, 80% support does not exist in reality. There are half of the respondents of the independent pollster Levada Center who definitely support the operation. And there are 30% who rather support it. The 30% are disoriented, sometimes frightened, wishing to behave correctly according to the rules of this country. Altogether, we have 70% plus support. But now this support is automatic, quiet, routinized, let's say stagnant. This is support for, let's say, sofa or couch troops, for support from lazy militarists. They say kind of let the professionals fight. I am for it. Just don't chase me into the trenches like this. Putin understands this, which is why he did not announce general military mobilization. Attention to war has waned right now. The encouraged behavior is to support the government in everything. People simply adapt to life in a rigidly authoritarian regime. So among elites, including cultural elites, the mood is the same. And it is fashionable to say, right or wrong, this is my country. So I must support it. It's a very convenient position. So here, this is a general picture, let's say.
I want to back up a little bit. Putin's clearly been very effective at maintaining enough support within the public, even if it's a little anemic, it's still support. So what is the main tool or tools of propaganda that the Kremlin is using to get its message out to the Russian people?
Paradoxically, despite the fact that the role of television was waning all the time, the main tool is television. People returned to their TV sets, especially people who are aged. And a lot depends on the way information is consumed, for sure. And when a lot of people are simply pegged to the television and they try to believe in the official information, because they're disoriented, as I said, and they want to have only one trustworthy source of the information. And because of that, television is the main source for a lot of Russians. But television, this is not the only tool in that sense. For instance, the brainwashing of school children in schools is also one of the tools. Various patriotic movements among young people, for instance, because Putin pays a lot of attention to younger generation. Even sometimes outdoor advertising, all this stuff has propaganda value. I would say that in the society, not in the civil society, where there are people who are thinking about the consequences of Putin's steps, but in society as such, the encouraged behavioral pattern is to support Putin's actions and support this war. Because, again, according to the vision of a lot of people from elite primarily, this is my country, so I will support all the steps which were orchestrated by the authorities.
So one of the benefits of the end of the Cold War, in theory, was a lot of Western businesses, luxury brands, or even McDonald's came to Russia, and Russian people could, benefit to the degree that it is a benefit from being able to purchase, Western goods. And all of those businesses, or a very large number of them, have either left, closed down as a result of the sanctions. And much was made of that, actually, in the West, about how big of an impact that would have on Russia and the Russian people at the beginning of the war. So what's the attitude now, right? I mean, a lot of places and malls are closed. Do the Russian public care? Does this matter? Is it having an effect?
The Russian public cares, but at the same time, the consequences, economic consequences of sanctions, of economic blockade, are not so visible right now. Yes, there are some problems, significant problems, primarily with inflation rate. It is quite high. Something in annual terms, it's around, let's say, 17%. But Putin says this is all about the West. The West is the source of this high inflation. And, guys, in the West, they have the same rate of inflation, etc., etc. At the same time, some businesses are simply in a stage of bankruptcy. A lot of them, primarily small and middle-sized businesses. Formally, unemployment is not so high, but right now it begins to grow, even in official terms, in official statistics. So this is simply the beginning of much bigger problems which are awaiting Russia in the nearest future. Some economists say that real problems will appear this year. Some of them say that serious problems will wait for people in the year 2023. Because of lack of resources, because of blockade of Russian oil and gas, the main source of the Russian budget and the main source of buying people's political loyalty, because a lot of people are dependent on state, and they're getting money in budget organization or in state companies. Right now, I must say that market is saving Russia, because Russian economy at the end of the day, despite the fact that there are a lot of state interventions in it, is market-based. And adaptation to the blockade is going so far. At least parallel, it means illegal imports have been established. So we have an opportunity to get some spare parts or something via this illegal import. But in a middle-term future, long-term future, it means a terrible primitivization of economic structure.
So you've done some really remarkable work since the start of the war, articles in Foreign Affairs, in the New Russia Times, other places. We'll put all those links in the show notes, and I encourage listeners to go read those pieces. They're really incredible. I want to talk about a couple parts of the pieces you wrote, starting with a character that you talk about, Granny Anya, who the Kremlin has sort of mythologized. So could you tell our listeners who Granny Anya is and how she became a symbol of Russian propaganda?
No, for the moment, paradoxically, it's kind of a forgotten symbol because it's a bit of an outdated story, which, however, is very important from the point of view that it reveals the mechanics and political technology by which the Kremlin operates. It's not profitable for the Kremlin to accentuate the heroes in the battlefields, because many of them are simply dead. The goal of Kremlin is to hide the information about the scale of losses, military losses. So because of that, Kremlin needs some new symbols for this operation, not only this letter Z and V, which are non-explainable, but they became symbols of this operation. They need human beings, symbols. So the story was quite funny, like an anecdote, because Granny Anya, Anna Ivanova, from, suburbs of Kharkiv, an elderly Ukrainian woman who went out waving a Soviet flag to greet troops entering her village, Russian troops, I mean. And she was swiftly co-opted by the Kremlin as a proof that Ukrainians were waiting eagerly for their Russian liberators. This is one of the main points of Russian propaganda. Later, it turned out that the woman had in fact taken the flag with her as protection to try to dissuade the Russians from destroying her village by reminding them of our shared Soviet past, because Russian side is obsessed by everything Soviet right now. Unfortunately, her fears were well founded, because in some time Russian bomb landed on her house. The destruction was not so serious, but the fact is that she was waiting for not in vain. But after that, everywhere her image appeared, and there was even a monument in Mariupol, and this monument was opened by the main political manipulator, the deputy head of Kremlin's administration, Sergei Kirienko, who pretends to be kind of a, let's say, general governor of occupied territories. So this is simply political technology, and we see how it works and how it will work.
In another piece, you did an analysis of book sales in Russia as a sort of way to look at the psyche of the Russian public. And you noted that nonfiction is down and fiction is way up, including George Orwell's famous novel of 1984.
Thought crime is death. Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death.
What do you think this says about the psyche of the Russian public?
Even before setting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon, because really people prefer it in their previous life. books on self-development, on business success, because primarily people lived a peaceful life. Now this is a time for another kind of life. People were shocked, people were frustrated, and this changing of priorities demonstrates that there was a tremendous shock that people have experienced because of this war. Even people who were supporting the special military operation. So their previous life became suddenly irrelevant, and they decided to understand what has happened. They have heard that somewhere in British world literature there were some examples of explaining this of this kind of regimes, and because of that, unexpectedly, George Orwell for some time became quite popular. Because books market is still more or less non-censored. So the story is about the confusion. The story is about the desire to understand what is really going on. And this is an attempt to find a distraction from war news. People want to read fiction. And this is all about the fatigue from war, from a state of permanent frustration.
When we come back, I'll ask Andrei about Finland and Sweden joining NATO and the long-term future of Putin and the Russian state. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I hope you're enjoying the episode. For more great episodes of The World Unpacked, make sure to hit that subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform. And tell all your colleagues at the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or just the next folks you have over for dinner that they should subscribe to. Thanks for listening. You claim that Russia has become what is called a hybrid totalitarian state, meaning that it is sort of inching closer and closer to closed, maybe militaristic style despotism, right, from where it was before, which is sort of open but a little bit authoritarian. Is this lurch irreversible in the coming years?
Primarily I must say that it was a very fashionable discussion among Russian wise men, among Russian experts. Do we live in a fully authoritarian state, or it is a, let's say, hybrid authoritarianism? Now it's not on the agenda, and I would say that this is a full-blooded authoritarian regime for sure, and it looks like that it has elements of totalitarianism. This is when behavior, in my opinion, that implies support for the authorities becomes not just encouraged but prescripted, obligatory support. It is, for example, visible for people working in sectors that are entirely dependent on state budget sector and state companies sector. And there is also new legislation, totalitarian legislation that practically turns dissenters into second-class citizens, foreign agents. They're labeled as foreign agents. In addition, for example, Putin declared at the very beginning of the operation that those who disagreed with him are national traitors. This is something from Stalinist era, and they are a fifth column, just like Putin became a publicist of Soviet times. And he called for self-cleansing of society. Self-cleansing sounds also not so good in the modern society in the 21st century. And people responded as if the Stalinist times had never gone anywhere. Denunciations became commonplace. Not so frequently, but we see everywhere, especially in schools, in universities. And the denunciators are both sides. I mean, professors and students, teachers, and even children or their parents. How to get away from it? I think the only possible recipe is to dismantle the system of Putin. This is not a problem of this year or next year, and I'm afraid it will take time. But to get away from this authoritarianism or hybrid totalitarianism, we need a radical change of power.
So while we're recording this episode, the NATO summit is currently happening in Spain. And as of the time of this recording, Finland and Sweden's application to join NATO the way has been cleared. Turkey's kind of stood down. Is this news being reported in Russia? And if so, how's it being received by either the public or the professional classes?
Now, after the beginning of this military operations, the reaction of the Russian authorities and politicians and public opinion to any external events has become very primitive. They are enemies. They are all attacking Russia all the time. The whole world, not whole world, the West is against us. And the problem is that people have got accustomed to this situation. Because for ordinary Russians, especially who support the operation in Putin, NATO, and especially the United States, are the main enemies responsible for the aggravation of the situation in Ukraine. And NATO is kind of a permanent enemy in that sense. European Union, Europe, this is kind of satellites of the United States, and the main source of problems is for sure Washington. As for elites, I think the problem is a complete lack of goodwill on Russia's part. And the West, NATO, sensing this, has also stopped trying to talk to Putin establishment. And this is a deadlock that does not involve peace talks. They are simply impossible in this model.
The West has tried a lot of different tactics to force Russia off the position that they've taken on Ukraine. Certainly, they're supplying Ukrainian military with tons of weapons. They've tried what is essentially a totally unprecedented sanctions regime with the European allies. They're attempting to stymie Russian resource gathering through their oil and gas exports. We talked already about the private sector and the businesses that have left Russia, and it goes on and on. It seems like nothing's worked. So I guess, is there anything that the West can really do that would have a real impact on Putin and his team's thinking on the war?
It's a very good question because, as it was during the annexation of Crimea, the first wave of sanctions was accepted or perceived by the majority of the population as an attack not on the elite, but as an attack on Russia as such, on Russian citizens. And the same story repeated right now. Okay, there were personal sanctions, it's all about elite, but now people understand that this is against not Putin, but against them, against their well-being, against their businesses, and against their capacity to survive. And it has such an effect that people begin to consolidate around Putin. This is kind of a Stockholm syndrome for them because, they can feel themselves hostages living in Russia, isolated Russia. But at the same time, they understand that they have only one commander of this besieged fortress. And because of that, they begin to support Putin, to accept his vision of the world. They accuse the West in everything. So in that sense, psychologically, politically, sanctions are perceived in this way. They help Putin at the end of the day. I understand the economic role of sanctions. Putin will have less resources to continue the military operation. But here is one more important point. I know about some conversations with Putin, people from economic bloc, so-called liberals, systemic liberals. They are trying to explain Putin that the economic consequences could be horrible for Russia. But Putin as I know, repeats all the time. The goals of the special operation must be implemented, despite the fact that we have some economic problems. So he will throw all the possible budget, business resources on the battlefields. He will try to continue this war at any cost. And it must be understandable in the West. So sanctions have some psychological, political, and even economic limits. And according to the polls, the public opinion is ready to survive this period. And even now, I would say that consumer sentiments are better than it was maybe 2 or 3 months ago, because people want to have hopes, good hopes for the future. And they know that sanctions are, let's say, forever, maybe, and they are ready to live under this sanctions regime. So, again, from this side, not so many benefits for the Western part.
You say that the Russian people want to have hope for the future. Totally understandable. Eventually, this war will end sooner rather than later, hopefully, but obviously the prospects for that look dim. Perhaps it'll be a negotiated solution. Who knows? But at some point, it will end. And you write that however it ends, Russia will continue to be viewed as an international outcast and endure isolation and condemnation. Can you delve into why you think that's the case?
Yeah, it's a big problem for Russians as not supporters of Putin, because we must divide the Russian people and Putin, Russia and Putin's regime. Even now, when Putin has turned the Russian nation into pariah, into the Germans in 1945. And this is a problem for the future, and this is a current problem. Russians are perceived as a kind of a homogeneous mass who are supporting Putin. Those who are against the war are also perceived in the same way. And this is a problem for liberally and Western-oriented people. And this is a psychological, moral side for the nation. But there are also objective processes of deterioration of quality of the human capital due to the disrupting of ties with the world, as we said, the primitivization of the structure of economy and labor markets, and indoctrination with the ideology of Putinism and imperialistic ideas. It spoils Russian nation. And this is a long-term deterioration of human capital. But today we must think about what will happen after Putin and how to rebuild Russia, how to rebuild Russians' brains and souls. And this is kind of a problem goal for the West as well, because let's talk about Russia in 10 years or 15 years. How West will cope with post-Putin Russia. This is also a question. And in that sense, I would say that Russians who are not supporting Putin, they need, let's say, help from the West, moral help. These Russians, they need understanding in the West that they are not equal to Putin. It's quite important.
I want to talk about a post-Putin world. However it comes about, it will eventually happen. And there's probably a couple, maybe more than two, but let's just focus on two scenarios that could result from that, right? One is probably more of the same, and one is something different. So let's start with something different. The Putin regime comes to an end. What's sort of a positive future for Russia that you could imagine at that point?
The first point is that post-Putin future is possible. for physiological reasons. He will disappear sometime. In 10 years, Putin and his camarilla will be around 80 years old. Of course, the cynical technocrats who are now on their way to run the Donbass, disregarding morality, they may continue his cause. So Putinism can survive Putin himself. But first point, perhaps there will be at least more pragmatic than Putin and less obsessed by ideology and the imperial idea, which is in the center of current ideological discourse. And the second point, historically, in Russia, after the disappearing of any dictator, Russian history is strongly personalized. Let's take Brezhnev period, Stalin period, etc., etc. So when this or that person disappears, the time of the period of liberalization is coming, inevitably. Even when Stalin died, these three quite close to him persons, they began the liberalization literally overnight. So we can wait for some liberal steps, even from some people who are now very conservative in their words, in their actions, who are quite close to Putin. So the very fact of the disappearance of Putin can contribute some optimism for the Russian future.
But there's no guarantee that a post-Putin Russia will necessarily go far in liberalizing, right? I mean, there's a lot of power structures in place. So what is this sort of doom and gloom post-Putin scenario? This very fact that there are a lot of politically crazy people around Putin, like Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, the main ideologue right now of this operation, Dmitry Medvedev, who became Hogue, Volodin, who is the Speaker of the Parliament. If they will be the inheritors of Putin himself, they can continue very aggressive general political line against the West, against liberal economy, against liberalization, against political democracy. But at the same time, in that case, the system could be less personalized. These figures are not so strong as Putin is. And because of that, I can predict that there will be a struggle in elites between different groups and different leaders. And in the end of the day, it could be useful, fruitful, it could be good for the nation. Because in order to survive after Putin, all these people, they will need the restoration of connection of ties with the West, pragmatic ties. In that sense, liberalization will come. Yes, for instance, Francoism survived Caudillo Franco, but in the end of the day, Spain became turned into democratic, political democratic state, and I hope that Russia will follow the steps of normal countries, despite the fact that historically we do not look so normal. So there are some hopes. Andrei, thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to make another plea to all of the folks listening out there. If you want to know what's going on in Russia from one of the best, most eloquent writers and thinkers on Russian politics, you got to read Andrei Kolesnikov. He's publishing all the time. You can go check him out on our website. We put a lot of pieces up. Follow him on Twitter. We'll put links to all that in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about these important issues.
Thank you so much for your sophisticated questions.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.